Welcome to the Literary Life podcast. We've grown quite significantly since our debut in 2019, and we've had many requests to highlight older episodes that new listeners may have missed, as well as revisit listener favorites. To honor that request, I present to you this episode of the Best of the Literary Life podcast.
Welcome to the Literary Life podcast, where your hosts Angelina Stanford and Cindy Rollins explore a life shaped by books, stories, and poetry. Each week, we will rescue story from the ivory tower and bring it to your couch, your kitchen, and your commute. The literary life is for everyone, because in the words of Stratford Caldecott, to be enchanted by story is to be granted a deeper insight into reality. Hello and welcome back to the Literary Life podcast. I am Angelina Stanford, and here with me is not Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because I would hate to see you argue about who is who. I am here with Thomas Banks and Cindy Rollins. Hello, everybody.
Delightful to be here.
Yes, delightful to be here.
Cindy's lying. It is not delightful. Cindy's at the beach right now. We've dragged her out of the ocean, and she is doing this podcast out of love for all of us. But these are your toes still in the water?
Oh, I'm all sandy right now, and I'm just sitting here in the condo, half wet, half sandy. So I will be back out there. I will be back out there in 45 minutes to an hour and a half.
You see, that's you just described your happy place, and you just described my unhappy place. Just the idea of being in a house, sandy. I'm just, oh man, that would be torture to me.
Well, I grew up sandy and wet, and I've never gotten over it, so I'm okay with it.
Yes, go ahead.
My husband doesn't like it, but he's being kind to me.
Cindy was always telling us how she's a beach girl, right? They took the girl out of the beach, but they can't take the beach out of the girl.
Yeah, I mean, really, it's weird, but I love the beach.
And you're in a landlocked state, you poor thing. Thank goodness you get out occasionally. We were actually just talking before we press record about we need to have a literary life beach retreat. So now that I'm throwing that out there, probably gonna get all these emails. Yes. If
anybody has a big giant house on the beach, I know out in California, I went to a retreat once that it was somebody's house. So if there's anybody out there with a house that they would like to offer for our retreat, we will take it.
We will take it. Email Atlee immediately and we will get that going. So today we are going to start talking about, this is the first of two episodes on Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I am very excited to talk about this book with you guys. This has always been a favorite of mine. I've enjoyed teaching it in the past. I don't teach that time period anymore, so I haven't taught it in a while. And a few months ago, when we were thinking about what books to do, Mr. Banks said, we should do Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I couldn't believe I hadn't thought of it myself. So I'm really glad you thought of it. And there's going to be so much to talk about in this book, and so much that's, of course, relative to our relevant, I should say, to our human condition. I don't want to say relevant to right now, because I hate the idea that things have to be relevant to right now. It's relevant to the human condition, which means, of course, it is relevant to right now and next year and last year, 100 years from now and 100 years ago. So that's my little soapbox about that. So before we get started, Mr. Banks, you've got a webinar coming up. You want to quickly tell us about that?
Well, yes, I'll be talking about the history of the French Revolution on Thursday, September 23rd. So I'll be going into that, talking about the principal revolutionaries, their stories and personalities, and how it plays out, and the effects it has on not just France, of course, but Europe at large, and how it's also intertwined with the development of Romanticism in literature and the arts. So it's not just a revolution in politics and warfare, but in the way that books are written and paintings painted and all that. So I'll be talking about that on the 23rd of this month.
I'm looking forward to that. The French Revolution is one of those things where we haven't gotten over it.
No, in so many ways, that's rather true. I mean, it's kind of the revolution that other revolutions copy later in history as well.
Well, that's a dumb one to copy.
yeah, you would think, but yes, but sadly so.
Yeah. There's so many things about history we think, well, that was a long time ago, and we close the door on it, and we don't realize we are still so much dealing with the the repercussions of it. So often we don't, we just deal with the surface level of things, and instead of really understanding the underlying causes.
Here's a frivolous thought based on Cindy. You just said that's a dumb revolution to copy. It made me think. What if you could write Yelp reviews for historical events? That would be 1 star. That's a dumb revolution to copy. No, that would be great.
That's a dumb revolution. Don't even go there.
Started with such high hopes, unfortunately disappointed in the end.
The Holy Roman Empire, really like such a come down after the Roman Empire. Are you kidding me? This is like an unnecessary sequel. But
can you imagine how inflammatory that would be? Trolls would be so happy.
Okay, so now I feel like we have to confess on the air here that this is a large part of our marriage. Mr. Banks and I making up fake Yelp reviews for all different kinds of things. We entertain ourselves endlessly with the fake Yelp review.
Maybe we should do Yelp reviews instead of commonplace quotes. Maybe
we should do just fake ones, right? Like we'll just be going about our day, and I'll just blurt out, "Well, this is not going to go well on their Yelp review," and and then we're off and running. Yeah, that. So now you get a little insight into the oddity that is our marriage. Works for us though. So if you want to find out more about Mr. Banks's podcast, he's grinning and I'm totally losing my words here. Look away. I can't look at my husband and talk at the same time. Sorry, y'all. You can find out more about that at houseofhumaneletters.com, and you can click on the webinar tab and you can register and you can find out more. Of course, everything we do is live or later, and you have lifetime access to the recording. Okay, so having gotten that out of the way, shall we share some commonplace quotes? Cindy, how about you? Let's get the beach.
Okay. Yeah, so I had
wipe the sand out of your journal there and share a quote with us.
Yeah, okay. So I on the beach this morning, something happened. I finished Boswell's Life of Samuel Johnson.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's and 10 other people in the whole world can claim that.
Lifetime goal, really. I think that when I was 16 or something, it went on my to be read list in my head, and I've been waiting all these years to complete this. So I feel very good about it. So I have a quote from that, which is kind of a funny quote, but kind of a true quote if you can get past the first part of it. So here is the quote, and this is Johnson talking. So he says, "I would rather," said he, "have the rod to be the general terror to all, to make them learn, than tell a child, if you do thus or thus, you will be more esteemed than your brothers or sisters. The rod produces an effect which terminates in itself. A child is afraid of being whipped and gets his task, and there's an end on it. Whereas by exciting emulation and comparisons of superiority, you lay the foundation of lasting mischief. You make brothers and sisters hate each other."
Oh, that is so good.
That is so Charlotte. Although she would not say whip a child, but she would say appealing to emulation. And
I was immediately thinking of the implications in the classroom, the competition in the classroom.
Yeah, because and we end up promoting this, lack of virtue instead of virtue, especially when we're in classical education where we're trying to promote this elusive idea of virtue.
Mm-hmm.
And just find out who the model boy or model girl is, and
and then beat them within an inch of their life.
Right, who everyone else hates.
Yeah, that's right. And what book have you ever read where that child wasn't? Poor Penrod, he had the model boy.
Oh my gosh.
Tom Sawyer had the model boy. Eustace, yep. Well, no, but there literally is a character called the model boy. It's not Sid in Tom Sawyer.
Oh, really?
He's the guy who brings he's all dressed up like Lord Fauntleroy and he's
and all the moms
old ladies to their seat in church, and he's the model boy, and they all hate him.
Oh my God. I was Cindy, you mentioned Penrod. It's George something in Penrod?
Georgie, yes. Georgie.
Oh
Georgie. Is that the one who wants to be a preacher?
He wants to be a preacher, yeah.
Yeah, Georgie. I forget how his last name, but it used to be a part of my vocabulary. Yeah.
Georgie Bassett, I think is what it was.
Oh, Georgie Bassett, yeah.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I wanted to kill that kid growing up.
Yeah.
Actually, don't they mug him in one? I think like they're pretending to induct him into their club, and like they're making their peace with him because their parents have insisted that you have to let Georgie into your
Oh,
camp. And they just
right.
like beat him up instead. That was a really satisfying
Like they
episode.
lead him somewhere. Yeah, yeah. So if you want to read a book in which you teach your children to be really bad, but it's kind of funny, then Penrod's the book for you.
You know, what's interesting is, so we're all laughing here. Like everybody knows who the model boy is or model girl, and everyone hates him. And so I taught Tom Sawyer to my middle school class last year. And when we got to the model boy, I said something like that. Like every town, every homeschool co-op, every church
Who is
youth
the
group.
model boy in Europe?
So I didn't put it like that, but I kind of gave this general, like, everybody knows who the model boy in town is. And every one of those kids was like, yep. And that they all knew. And I said, isn't it sort of like a universal thing that we all really despise this person? And they all said yes. And this is just, we're talking about just a universal human condition, right?
Right.
I did have one student in one of the sections sheepishly raise her hand and say, I think I might be the model boy in my town. I said, we'll have to talk later.
No.
We'll have to talk
Let's
later.
give this kid's address to all of his classmates.
Well, isn't that a good level of self-awareness? And maybe, she knows it's not a good thing now, so she can work on that.
It's one of those things, while, if you think you might be, you're probably not, because you're way too self-aware.
Right.
So like, if you think you're a narcissist, you're probably not.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, thank goodness.
All right, Mr. Banks, what do you have now that Sydney's just like started us off with a bang here?
Oh, yes. So I have one from the English historian G.M. Young from his book Daylight and Champagne, talking about Shakespeare. He says, do not call attention to Shakespeare's mistakes, for they are probably your own.
Oh, so good.
Wow. Yes, how humiliating.
It's true. Yeah. I know. So when you start thinking, I could have written that line better, and then it's like, well, no, probably I couldn't on a more sober examination.
I've been involved in conversations with people about certain Shakespeare plays where they start sentences with, well, Shakespeare's big mistake in this scene was, like, you have to stop talking now.
Well,
I think he meant to say my inability to understand Shakespeare in this scene is.
Well, that's really appropriate, I think, for this book, because I don't know if I heard you guys say it or if I heard it somewhere else this week. I don't think it could have been Johnson, because he would have been before. But someone said Robert Louis Stevenson was constantly tired of people telling him how to write this book better, how they would have written Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Right. We were talking about that in the Patreon, I think, the other night.
Oh, yes. I thought that was so interesting because, as you're reading it, and the movies are so different. So the movies are kind of retelling of this book. But anyway, we'll get into that as we get on.
We will. Okay, so I have my commonplace quote next. And I've joked a few times that my husband is the thief of commonplace quotes. And he's not really. He reads an insane amount. The reality is that he is a much more dedicated commonplacer than the woman he is married to is. And so our daily life is, I read something, I run and show him, and then that is as far as I go with it. And then later I see he has commonplaced it on Facebook, of course, and not attributed it to me, in which case I rant and rave and say, hey, you stole my commonplace quote. So in keeping with that, he's giving me his smug grin now. In keeping with that tradition, my commonplace quote today, I stole from him. I stole it right off his Facebook wall. So turnabout's fair play, my friend. It's a Robert Louis Stevenson quote, and it's so good. It's worth being shared, even if we weren't doing a Robert Louis Stevenson episode. But it's going to be very apropos because we were actually talking before the episode here, Mr. Banks and I, about some of the bad Freudian readings of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and the lessons they're trying to pull out. So this is Robert Louis Stevenson on what he thinks about all of that. This is from an essay called Books That Have Influenced Me. The most influential books and the truest in their influence are works of fiction. They do not pin the reader to a dogma, which he must afterwards discover to be inexact. They do not teach him a lesson, which he must afterwards unlearn. They disengage us from ourselves. They constrain us to the acquaintance of others, and they show us the web of experience, not as we see it for ourselves, but with a singular change, that monstrous consuming ego of ours being for the nonce struck out.
That's a really strong paragraph.
It's
I
so good.
Yeah, I commonplace that too, so it's okay. Yeah,
And I stole
you
it.
stole it. Well, turnabout's fair play.
Shamelessly stole it. What this is getting at what we always talk about over here. About this is not about didacticism. It's not about pulling out a lesson or a moral. Even this book that we're going to read, which is heavily allegorical, as we're discussed, it is not meant for a lesson to be pulled out. So I love what he says about what's really going on is a book is an experience that frees us from the monstrous ego that is ourself, strikes us out for a moment. And that's almost exactly what C.S. Lewis says, that literature is an experience, and it's experience in which we can transcend ourselves, that, for a few precious moments, we can get out of ourselves. And of course, that's an incredible gift, and it's necessary to human experience. And my mind is going in a million places right now, and I'm thinking that's not the topic of this episode, so stop talking. But I mean, I'm thinking about cathedrals, which were built the way they were to give you the sense of you're small and the universe is big. And there have been some really interesting work done amongst some philosophers of late who have pointed out that the more that human beings have made the world small and themselves bigger, the more psychic angst we have, the more anxiety, depression, despair. Like it's destroying us as people to think that we've made the universe small and ourselves big. And that, and it's interesting because these are not Christian philosophers, but they have observed that it is simply not a place of thriving for human beings to be all up in their own selves all the time. That we have got to deliberately get out of ourselves and be reminded that the universe is big and we are small.
Yeah, talk about modernity and small places. We live in this little thing we hold in our hand, and it's so
and we are master of it, right?
Yes, and it's very small, but it's a rabbit hole. It's Alice in Wonderland.
Well, it is. I mean, golly, there's so much to think about right there and I'm just as guilty of this as anybody. So please, if I'm pointing fingers, I'm pointing it back at myself. I'm pointing it right back at myself. But
you really are bad about that.
Well, I mean, I just think about how when I spend any time on social media, and I don't think I'm unique here, you walk away thinking, man, I am the smartest person that I know. All these other people are idiots, right? It doesn't even matter what the conversation is, right? The conversation could be on, the best way to cut your toenails. You're like, these idiots.
Yeah, that's true.
Where'd they go to school? Who taught them that? This is, and you get, but that can't be good for our souls, that we go around seeing these indicators all day long that we're the smartest person in the world. I mean, honestly, if I'm the smartest person in the world, we need to just hang it up right now.
Well, that is a very good point, because like one time on Mere Motherhood, one of our pages, there someone was saying how you should do your dishwasher. Or should you put your utensils inside with the prongs down or the prongs up? And people were, even among such a silly thing like that, there were like attitudes like, if you don't do it my way, something's wrong with you. And that was on both sides of the issue. And it shows us how we and I think that quote even covers this, because it say something we'll have to undo later.
Yep.
And I think we have so many things that really doesn't matter. You're going to get self-righteous over. I mean, it's fun to be self-righteous in a fun way, like, oh no, we always have to do it this way, and joke about it. But in reality, when you're separating yourself from other people, drawing lines in the sand over things that matter so little,
if ever there was a live and let live topic, loading the dishwasher might be it.
We're a tines down family. Yeah.
Not in the age of COVID.
Oh yeah, things.
Are y'all? So am I. I hate to say that, but I mean, I hate to divide our audience from us in any way. But
okay, we have to be a tied down family, because I am so clumsy. I will stab myself. So for my own safety, we need to have sharp objects pointing away from me.
I don't understand how you take them out of the dishwasher if they're up, because then your hands are all over the part you're going to eat. I don't know. To me, that
okay. So now I feel like the tines up people are yelling, and I know that the tines up people feel like tines down destroys the dishwasher basket, and it can. I've seen that happen.
What is the debate in in Gulliver's Travel?
Oh, the egg.
The egg.
Are you a
debate.
little ender or a big ender?
Yes.
Yeah, we don't
ender.
even do. We've solved that problem we just crack all our eggs before we.
We don't even eat eggs anymore.
We don't even have an egg. We don't even have the little egg thing at our table. Do y'all have? Does Thomas have an egg?
No,
egg
he
cup?
is not that fancy.
Ah.
No,
We'll have to get Jeeves to get us one of those.
Right.
No, we moderns
little
have
egg
solved, but we moderns have solved the big end or little end debate about the egg. And now you can buy your eggs pre-cracked for you in a carton in the refrigerated section. So see, we solved it. Modernity's great. We solved it.
What? You can buy them pre-cracked? Oh, you can, can't you?
The egg, it's fake, right? The egg beaters, but yeah.
Ugh. Yeah.
Yes,
Let's
exactly.
leave them
I
in
was
the egg.
sarcastically saying modernity fixed it, but yeah.
Okay. Thank goodness that we haven't fixed it.
Anyway, so I love that quote by RLS, Robert Louis Stevenson, who was called amongst his intimates as Lewis. So if you hear us saying Lewis, it's going to be confusing because I'll be quoting C.S. Lewis and Robert Lewis, and it's going to be just Lewis's everywhere.
Well, let me say one more thing then, because
Go ahead.
So I heard I went through all of Scribes lists to hear all the different readings, and two British narrators said Robert Louis Stevenson. And I thought, I've never heard him be called Louis. And the rest of them said Lewis. But it was interesting. I thought, well,
I have not heard Robert Louis Stevenson say his own name. I've only ever read it. But
yeah, did they call him Louis or Lewis? But I've always said Lewis. And I've never heard it any other way until this week.
Well, that's a French pronunciation. So now we have lots of questions about what a Scotsman have. Would not be unheard of for a Scotsman to use the French pronunciation.
Yeah, but nobody else. I've never heard anybody.
I've never heard it either. Great.
Another
thing for us to line up over on the page, Cindy. We're going to have the Louis and Lewis corners, and we're going to fight.
This is perfect for our thing. This is what we're going to fight over this week, people.
At least we three are in agreement.
Yes, I would say Lewis, and they were British guys. Both were British guys. So I don't know.
It's certainly spelled Louis.
But I was reading with another British guy, and he didn't.
My British narrator also says Lewis.
Okay, so
yeah, we've solved nothing now.
Yes, sorry.
We're just going to call him RLS because I know how to say that.
Yeah, RLS.
Should we start with a sketch of his life?
Before we do that, actually, I thought we could start with a little sketch of each of us with Robert Louis Stevenson. So, Cindy, let's start with you. But you said the most interesting thing the other night on the Patreon that you had a son who was in love with David Balfour. I mean, that's not a book that a lot of people read.
Yeah, he loved that. He read Kidnapped, and then the next one is David Balfour, and he loved it. And he always wanted to read it again, and he read it again and again, and he just loved that book. So I don't know if I read it out. I probably read that out loud once years ago after, he liked it so much. I thought, well, I'm going to read it out loud. And we had read Kidnapped out loud. And I've read a lot of Robert Louis Stevenson. I have not read his nonfiction yet, but we really are huge fans of his in our house. My husband loves I want to always say the Black Company, the Black Arrow. He also loves the White Company by Arthur Conan Doyle. He loves that time period and that War of the Roses era. And so those were very popular books in our house, all of them.
We also are huge Robert Louis Stevenson fans, and I think it's unfortunate that he sort of gets lumped in as a children's author. I mean, I think he is a phenomenal author, and just the breadth of his writing, the poetry, the essays, the adventure stories, which he almost single-handedly creates the adventure story genre. He invents almost single-handedly science fiction in this story. Just an extraordinary imagination, and of course suffered from ill health. Yeah, we love him. We love Robert Louis Stevenson. I teach Treasure Island every third year in my middle school class, and that is always a huge hit. The kids
it's a hard book to read, and yet kids grasp it right away, and adults will sometimes, like The Wind in the Willows, adults will sometimes struggle reading Treasure Island, but the kids hang with it, and it really captures their imagination.
I was surprised. At the end of the year, I always asked them, what was your favorite book that we read this year? And I was really surprised that most of them said Treasure Island, because like you said, it was by far the most difficult book we read.
Yeah.
but they love it. There is something of the eternal youth in Lewis's imagination, I think.
Yes,
I think he's a
definitely.
child at heart. How about you,
Mhm.
Mr. Banks? Tell us about you and RLS.
Well, I mean, yeah, Treasure Island was the first book of his I had read to me. Or actually, no, I take that back. Probably A Child's Garden of Verse was
Mhm.
the first one. I remember that one being on my parents' shelves, and then yeah, later on after that came Kidnapped. Kidnapped I liked a lot in middle school, and I reread that one again about 3 or 4 years ago when I was on summer break, and yeah, I find that really holds up well. I think I understood it better because I knew a little bit more about the period in which it takes place. And it's also he also wrote it as a tribute to Walter Scott, who was one of his
Fellow
a
Scotsman.
fellow Scotsman, a big influence. And yeah, I like Stevenson a lot, and I've also he also led a life which makes an interesting story by itself. So yeah, lifelong invalid. I mean, as we'll talk about with this story, he actually wrote Dr. Jekyll when he was laid up in bed.
And his illness was consumption. We
Yeah,
should
consumption.
say.
Yeah, at the end of his life, I think he weighed something like 80 pounds. I've seen actually,
Oh,
like, you look at photographs of him in the last couple of years of his life in the South Sea Islands, and he looks like kind of a walking skeleton.
Mm.
But always like a strangely, I mean, cheerful man. You would expect, someone who suffered from a chronic illness like that to develop a, morose or depressive streak, but he never did. Always a very energetic guy, so much as his body allowed him to be. Had a very happy marriage, actually. One of the rare authors who it moves from place to place, kind of always seeking out the warm climate that's going to restore his health. Never finding it, but always like a pretty happy domestic life. Married an American woman, somewhat older than he, who was a divorcee. And they're
She's an interesting character
Fanny
herself.
Osborne. Yeah, she was. Yeah, he actually. He gave her co-author credit in a couple of the books that he wrote because she would.
And
I
she
mean,
had a big
didn't
role in
actually-
this one too.
Yeah, she didn't write with him, but he trusted her editorial instincts a
Mhm.
lot. She was a painter and also a travel writer of some gifts. So yeah, she was kind of his first and best critic. And anyway, so yeah, their life together was a pretty never a still one, but I dare say an exciting and for the most part a happy one. He died young. So of course he died when he was, I think, in his early 40s. Died when he was straining to open a bottle, and that induced a stroke, and he died on the spot.
Oh my
Mm.
gosh.
I know.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Poor
I
thing.
love A Child's Garden of Verses, and many of those poems have made it into just my vocabulary on a daily basis, really.
Before we get too much further, we had a little powwow before we hit play to decide how we were going to handle spoilers. So we want to give you a warning that there will be some light spoilers in this episode. So we will not tell you how this book is going to end, but we are going to presume that you know the relationship between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because we've decided that is just part of our cultural imagination, and people who've never read the book know the phrase Jekyll and Hyde. So if you don't know what that is, turn this episode off right now and finish the book and then start it back. If you do know the
Short
relationship,
book, by the way, if you
Very
haven't
short.
read it yet, it's a very short book.
it's basically a long short story. It's
Right.
very short, and so we're not going to spoil the ending of the book, but so we're going to lightly spoil the relationship between Jekyll and Hyde. All right. So having said that, now we'll talk about the book, and we will presume this knowledge. So continue at your own risk. All right. So Mr. Banks, tell us more about Robert Louis Stevenson, so we can kind of put him, both understand who he is and where he's coming from as a writer, and sort of where he fits into the canon of British writers.
Well, certainly. So he's born to a respectable, hardworking family of lighthouse builders. That was the family business. His father was
Wow.
a Scottish lighthouse architect. He grew up in Edinburgh in a pretty strict religious environment. He has one piece of writing. It's an essay called "On Nurses," and he talks about the nurses of one's childhood and the mark they leave. And I guess he had kind of a scary nurse when he was a small boy, who was, I mean, as nurses, in the Victorian era would, she was, his catechist and taught him some of the rudiments of his faith. And you get the impression reading about him that such religion as he had mostly consisted of the fire and brimstone elements, with redemptive grace left out, or at least kind of shunted off to one side. So yes, he had a sort of you could say nurse haunted imagination. And he talked about in this essay, he talks about someday perhaps in the kingdom of heaven we shall find out that nurses are no more. So yeah, he had a pretty not a a violent or abusive or criminally neglectful childhood, but a severe one. And he also determined when he was fairly young when he started his career at Edinburgh University, that he didn't want to go into the family business. So that kind of classic father-son tension. His father wanted him to take up the trade that the family has pursued for a century and more, and Stevenson had adopted kind of bohemian ways. He wore, kind of flashy velveteen jackets.
Love his fashion sense.
Yeah, he was always kind of a snappy dresser. If you've seen any of his portraits by John Singer Sargent. And so he led to a falling out with his father, which happily was eventually repaired. But so yeah, he was more of a free spirit than his family than fit in well in the family environment. So he began his writing career in college, writing short stories and essays for magazines. I think his first published piece was something called "On the Philosophy of Umbrellas." You just want to read that from the title. Shortly afterwards, he met and fell in love with this American woman traveling abroad. And he decides that I have to marry this woman. So he goes, and he's very sick. I mean, he's already contracted consumption by this point, and he has a rough and tempestuous voyage over the Atlantic Ocean. I think traveling, third class in the bowels of a ship. Then travels overland, not really knowing anything about America, to track this woman down in California where she lived. They get married. She actually had, I think, a couple of children from previous marriage. His family is, of course, scandalized by this. He takes her back, though, introduces her to the family, and she was charming enough to win them over. So kind of a happy ending there.
I like those stories of men who are willing to travel over a whole country to find their woman. I'm just saying. He's grinning again.
I didn't do it with consumption though, so I guess like his dedication kind of stands on a higher level than mine. But anyway, so yeah, much of the rest of his life is spent traveling. He and his wife actually spent their honeymoon in an abandoned mining camp in Nevada. He wrote a book about this, I think, called The Silverado Squatters, and much of his early writing actually is travel writing. So he writes Travels with a Donkey in the Savane. So books about travels in France and Spain and in America, the Amateur Emigrant. And he doesn't really become recognized as a writer of fiction until Treasure Island in, I think, 1883, 1884 becomes an overnight success. And he wrote that one, I think, to kind of just sort of like the Swift Family Robinson, like sort of entertainment for the kids. And I don't think he actually meant to publish that one right away, but when he started writing it, I think it was he started saying that this is I might have the beginnings of something here, and he certainly did.
So his life is 1850 to 1894. So almost
Correct, yeah.
Almost the same dates as the reign of Queen Victoria. He's like the consummate Victorian here.
Yeah, born right in the middle of the period and died right at the end of it. And actually, he was he's part of the canon and very respectable now, but he was seen as kind of a revolutionary writer in a way, because one literary convention he breaks with, he doesn't write 3-volume novels.
Right.
He thought the form was just too baggy. It inevitably leads to just waste passages where nothing happens. So like even his novels tend to be kind of on the short,
Well,
concise
I think
side.
you forget he's Victorian because he doesn't write like a Victorian writer.
No,
He's
not at all.
and
So like he doesn't. I don't think he wrote much for serials either, in the Dickens, George Eliot fashion. So yeah, his books.
and he's
tend to
not
be,
as wordy as the Victorians, and he's not as preachy as them.
That's great, actually. That was actually like held against him too. Like he's not writing 3-volume novels. Who does this upstart think he is? And like one of the early critics, how's this for arbitrary, said that his sentences are too short. Just, seriously, like how short is too short a
I mean,
sentence?
he's not Ernest Hemingway. He's long compared to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, but anyway, so yeah, so he was kind of in his day, not following the general practices of the literary establishment as it then existed.
And really, as I said, kind of invents some new genres.
Yeah, like the boy's adventure story that sort of reaches its high point with him, and there's the others of that, like Harrison Ainsworth and some lesser names, and Rider Haggard. Rider Haggard is he wrote the one really good one,
King Solomon's Mines.
and
Lewis was a big fan of that as a boy.
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis, I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Wrong Lewis. This is going to be confusing to me. So he gets to a point where he writes this story, and I love the story. So now we're in the 1880s, and I love this because this is, of course, a similar story to Mary Shelley, where so he wakes up, he's yelling in his sleep. And so his wife wakes him up and he says, "Why did you wake me up? I was just at the best part." And he was dreaming this story. And so he got up and got pencil and paper and then frantically spent 3 days writing it all out. And when you hear stories like that, though, that's almost always the best stories, where it just comes to you in a whole that way. So he, as you said, his wife Fanny is his first and most trusted editor. So he gives her the story,
and she didn't like it.
She didn't like it, right? But she was very perceptive. She could see that this was kind of a mythic story. She said allegory. We'll define these terms. Well, mythic is what C.S. Lewis uses, and I think that's more what she's getting at. That these are types. These characters are types. It's not an allegory in the sense that, Dr. Jekyll is, Prime Minister Disraeli. It's not an allegory like that, but these are types of people. And so she says, look, this is an allegory, Lewis, and you're trying to write it like a story.
Yeah, he had written a fairly straightforward, just kind of meat and potatoes thriller. But she thought, there are depths here that needed, further exploration.
So in true I'm an artist fashion, he throws the original manuscript into the fire I love this. I would never have the courage to this, so that he would not be tempted to go back and use any of those passages, and he was forced to start completely over. And so he wrote it again in about 3 to 6 days, and this time nailed it.
Yeah.
Wow.
So what little what being bedridden with a chronic illness can do for you, I guess.
That's right. So you think when your mom or teacher hands back your paper and says, rewrite this paragraph, that's rough. I'm just start throwing everything in the fire, like start over.
Yeah. Teacher's fire. There you go. Wouldn't that be cool? The teacher sits at their desk with this little stove behind them, and everybody waits while they read and throws it in the stove. I bet you more would go in the stove than got past it.
Oh yeah, what's that Flannery O'Connor quote? People say, "Oh, I'm losing it now." Her quote about that the colleges are producing too many writers, and she says she wishes they'd stop producing any of them or something like that. But I'm loosely paraphrasing here. Yeah,
there is a funny quote about that. But.
So Fanny Stevenson, of course, is completely right in recognizing that this is a larger than life story, that this is a story that is not just about these individual characters, but is about types of human beings and the kinds of temptations we have and the we'll get into that more. But she was not alone in this. So C.S. Lewis, and I cannot remember which essay this is in, but he was a big Robert Louis Stevenson fan, of course, being an Irishman. He would have grown up with the Scots writer fresh in his mind, and he loved a good boy's adventure story himself. And so It's in an essay where Lewis is talking about myths and how myth works, and that the real power of myth is in its sort of bare bones shape. And this is why, and actually this might help to clarify something for us, because everybody's always sort of looking for like, what's the best version of a myth? What's the best retelling? And we're always looking for like a really good written story retelling. C.S. Lewis says, really, you don't have to obsess about that, because the power of a myth is in its types and its overall shape. And that's why it can succeed even when it's not super well written. And so he talks about how the power of a myth is of such that you could just read a summary of a myth and you would still receive the power of it. It doesn't, so it doesn't matter if the dialogue is so realistic and the descriptions are so great and kind of all the things we hyper focus on with stories. He says that's really not relevant, that the power of a myth is in its type, and which, so that's a whole other thing. But it's one of the reasons why you can give a child an adaptation of a myth or any kind of mythic story, and it's going to be fine, because it's not really relying on kind of the things that a modern day novel is on. And so Lewis goes on to say in that essay that this is true, of course, of mythology proper, like you open up your Edith Hamilton and that's myths. But he says this is also true of any story that has the same sort of mythic characteristic. And the example he gives is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So he gives that example in the essay as a modern story that reaches mythic proportions. And I mean, I honestly don't think there's a higher compliment to a book than to say this has reached mythic proportions. That it is going to be the kind of thing that, and it did, that just saturates our cultural imagination. I mean, people who couldn't tell you Robert Louis Stevenson wrote this book could make a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde reference and know what that means. That means a two-faced person or something like that. You look like you want to say something.
And Lewis, and one point that he stresses is that, as Angelina said, the power of the myth doesn't necessarily depend upon the art with which it's presented. So, I mean, he says that, sure, the myth of, he brings the example of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, the poet who went down to the underworld to save his bride from death. I mean, he says that yes, Ovid and Virgil, amongst others, made good poetry of this story, but you could imagine a much less powerful author presenting it in his clumsier way, perhaps, which nonetheless would communicate something memorable in it, something primordial, for lack of a better word, primordially attractive, or something that summons up the imagination in a kind of a magical way.
And I think that Stevenson has succeeded in that. I mean, and so, like I was saying, people who, I think we're going to enjoy reading the book. I'm not saying don't read the book, but I'm saying that the concept of the dual-natured Jekyll and Hyde, people who've never read this book and maybe don't even know it is a book, maybe just think it's a movie or something, the power of that idea of there are two sides to us warring, it gets across even if you don't have the book. So there's something incredibly powerful in just the concept of this story, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
You mentioned it being a movie. I mean, it is a story with an interesting afterlife for any comic book fans, because Stan Lee, the character of the Incredible Hulk, he said, was inspired by Dr. Jekyll and, well, yeah, like the mild-mannered scientist
in the cyber laboratory.
Right, because of the gamma rays or whatever. So Bruce Banner becomes, the raging, Hulk. So yeah, it's kind of a similarity there.
Okay, I wish you could see me. My mouth is totally open right now. I
feel like a nerd for knowing that,
but that's oh gosh, my students would love that. Cindy, did you know that?
No, I did not know that. I mean, I mean, I've seen that concept play out many times in different stories, but I did not know that.
Well, so yeah, my next point was going to be, this book is incredibly influential. And I just finished reading on my own The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, which is written 5-6 years after this story. And immediately I just started talking Mr. Banks's ear off about, like, this is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's basically the same story, right? That Dorian Gray's got this monster in him, but he's got this, respectable public veneer. And then Mr. Banks said, well, Oscar Wilde was hugely influenced by Robert Louis Stevenson, and even said,
when Oscar Wilde was in prison in 1895 to 1897, Stevenson's books were among those that he asked for from friends, to while away the time with. So yeah, I don't know that they knew each other, but Wilde was definitely a fan.
And he was Irish, right?
Wilde was Irish. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
In my mind, the islanders all sort of stick together in the English society.
The Celts.
The Celts, exactly. So I do want to place him in the writers of the late Victorian period because they are dealing with different things. And I think that's going to help us to understand what he's going for as well. So the early Victorians, your George Eliot, your Charles Dickens, your Trollope, we've talked before in here about how they are social reformers.
Mm-hmm.
So they are just really, they're zealous in, we've got to get these child labor laws passed. We need to clean up the orphanages. What about the children? That kind of thing. The woman question. They're very socially oriented and reform oriented. The late Victorians are a little bit different than that. Do you want to talk about what they're doing?
Yeah. So, I mean, and there's more than one current of literature that's being written at this point. So you have the aesthetes like Walter Pater and Oscar Wilde, the art for art's sake people, and Stevenson in some ways kind of fits into that camp. But Stevenson is, and this is actually a stick that after his death, it's sort of odd. After Stevenson's death, quite a number of his books actually went out of print for a while. People,
wow.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just he had huge success in the last decade and a half of his life, and then sort of the inevitable reaction, people started looking at him and nitpicking and saying, well, he's really just kind of a fancified writer of children's stories. He's an escapist. I mean, with his cheery false optimism, the world is so full of a number of things. I think we should all be as happy as kings. Actually, even this book, one acquaintance of his wrote him some really mean letters about it, saying that this book is just this is clearly the attempt of a shorter catechist to get into the dark side of human nature, and just completely unable to do it. He says that the Mr. Hyde character is not convincingly evil. Amusingly says we don't see him committing any class crimes on a large scale.
Just murder.
This guy, by the way, who writes him, this William Archer, was a Fabian socialist and a friend of Bernard Shaw. So since he's not specifically oppressing the poor,
interesting.
But that is kind of true about this book. You see that because if you watch the movies, they actually do show Hyde in more gory glory, if you would.
Okay.
But it's like, showing what is implied in the movies. Whereas when you read the book, it's really just implied for the most part, except for the one scene where he loses his temper with the.
Yeah, it's a lot more constructed on people's reactions to him. Everybody says, "Oh, he's a monster, he's a fiend."
I mean, it's kind of the same. I mean, very different story, but kind of the
Homer.
Same effect as I was going to say, like Beowulf. Like you never really get a description of Grendel, but just have people's reactions to him.
Same thing.
Hyde also, like you get the impression there's just something.
Nobody can put their finger on
it. Like whenever people are asked to describe him, it's like, yeah, exactly. I couldn't say. There was just something.
There's something about him,
repulsive about him that I didn't like.
Which I would think visually you couldn't capture that. You're going to have to just make him grotesque looking.
Yeah,
but I think it's great that he does it this way because it makes it a book that everybody can read. Whereas if it was a book about how evil Hyde was. It would be unreadable by many of us.
Well, actually, but don't you think that's a profound insight that sometimes evil can be really hard to put your finger on, right? Like something just feels off here. I couldn't, no, his ears are in proportion, his face, he's not hideously deformed or anything. I love that everybody keeps describing him as he doesn't have a deformity, but he gives the impression of deformity.
Yeah.
So there's something kind of mangled about him, which we're going to find out it's his soul. So basically this guy, though, that you're talking about, he's upset because Robert Louis Stevenson is not being a social reformer.
He's mean to a girl in one scene. But I mean, other than that, though, I mean, he commits murder once, but like it's not like he commits 1,000 murders.
So he wants it to be like, I own a factory and I'm oppressing the masses.
He went on. It's like, it's so awful. Then he even goes after Stevenson himself and he says that, you who have been bedridden by life, you don't have a right to your happiness. Like your sort of ultimately optimistic view of, good, evil might triumph for an hour, but good eventually wins the day. And that after Stevenson died, a lot of people, sort of went after him on the same grounds that Stephen is just boyishly naive and cheerful, and didn't really have anything to say about life, which, as we all know, is dark and serious.
Well, it's funny because we
Um,
just talked about that on the Patreon last week about the fact that suffering and pain seem so much more real to us than hope or joy.
Yeah.
And so we're so dismissive of optimism as it's naive. It's not realistic. I've got my nose to the facts. I see the hard reality, and life is pain and life is suffering. But that's just part of the story.
Yeah. G.K. Chesterton, who read actually a very good biography of Stevenson, said that he was the odd example of a man who can feel miserable for 22 hours a day, but regards the 2 hours when he's feeling, healthy, like he can stand on his own 2 feet, as the normal hours, and the rest is the exceptions.
Well, I think you have a lot of nerve to criticize someone who lives chronically ill on death's bed as saying you don't know that life is pain and suffering. I dare say Lewis Stevenson knew life was pain and suffering more than the guy who wrote that article.
I have that impression. Yeah.
So I have a quote I was going to use today from C.S. Lewis on national repentance. It kind of goes with what y'all are saying. So I'm going to read this from God in the Dock. The essay is on national repentance, but Lewis says, the first and fatal charm of national repentance is, therefore, the encouragement it gives us to turn from the bitter task of repenting our own sins to the congenial one of bewailing, but first of denouncing the conduct of others.
I like that book a lot.
And it just seems like that is, these social reformers are going to bewail instead of looking at their own hearts, they're going to point the finger at someone else.
Yeah. Compound for sins we are inclined to by damning those we have no mind to.
Yeah.
What's that from?
That's Samuel Butler. Hugh the Glass.
My husband always quotes bits of poetry, and I'm always excited when I recognize one. That doesn't happen all the time. So he's not a social reformer, and he is interested in what a great many of the late Victorians are interested in. And I think this is true of Oscar Wilde as well. This sort of public-private dichotomy in Victorian life. So if we can go back, the Regency periods, this would be the early 1800s. This would be, Jane Austen's era. The Regency period is marked by, of course, King George III is taken ill, and his son, the Prince of Wales, is acting as regent. That was a time that was extremely decadent.
Yes.
To be nice, over the top, sinful. And the country sort of took its cue from their leader, and it was wild times in England, shall we say? It was wild.
The regent George IV famously was what in today's money would be several billion pounds in debt by the time he attained his majority. But mostly for gambling and spending money on horses and expensive mistresses and things like that.
A dissipated life.
This is the first gentleman of Europe.
And so this was the tone of the country.
He had good taste in books, though. He was a fan.
He liked Jane Austen.
He liked his one redeeming.
He wanted Jane Austen to write a novel about the Regency.
The House of Hanover.
Yeah, and she wouldn't do it.
Politely, Your Grace, perhaps I should,
stick
plow
to
my own furrow or something like that.
Yeah, I'm gonna stay in my lane. Thanks, though. But what ends up happening is when Victoria takes the throne, which is 1837. It's on the tip of my tongue, but for some reason 41 was popping in my head too. I always get the First Reform Act and her ascendancy to the throne mixed up. Anyway, so she takes the throne, and she's going to set a new moral tone for the country.
Yeah.
So Victoria and Victorianism becomes synonymous with a high moral standard.
And she exemplifies that. Limited ideal, but she does exemplify it perfectly. Even the way she dresses is kind of purposely frumpy, very, very middle class, and she sort of the first middle class queen, if you will.
And big family, a devoted husband, lots of children, right? And so this is, I'm going to put the country back on a good moral footing. So what ends up happening, and of course, I'm not saying that's not a good thing to do. That was a great thing to do. What ends up happening is you have a great deal of emphasis on public morality, public manners. And after a while, people start to say, but I don't know that we're actually any better than we've ever been before. We're just hiding it.
It creates a like false emphasis in life when decorum becomes 9/10 of the moral law.
Right. And so you see in a book like this, and again in Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, and I promise I won't spoil The Picture of Dorian Gray. I won't spoil the ending, but I think if you pick up the back of the book, Dorian Gray and a painting have a little deal with the devil here. And so I think both authors, what strikes me is both of them are very interested in playing with this idea that when a man presents a public face to the world of respectability and high morals, that doesn't mean there's not a hideous monster lurking underneath.
That's not the whole of him. Yeah.
Right. And so they're interested in this duality, this dual person, the fact that we're not integrated people, the fact that we a patina of respectability passes for actual character in the Victorian age. Of course, they're very right to point at that. I mean, we are dealing with all of that as a culture. I mean, think about all of the high profile Christian leaders who are falling to scandals. We are also reckoning with people's public persona. How could a man who looks so pious and said pious things, how could he actually have been doing all of these things secret? So this is something that interests them. I mean, even you go back to Jane Austen, and she's interested in that. So much of what she's doing is questioning what makes a gentleman. Is it gentlemanly behavior or is it gentlemanly character? And so you look at a character like Wickham, who looked the gentleman, played the part of the gentleman, but you will know, sir, are no gentleman, right? And so they're all dealing with this same thing. So I think if we think about the public selves and the private selves, and that manners and respectability does not equal good character, and that there could be a monster lurking underneath that outward shine, I think that's going to help us to understand what Robert Louis Stevenson is doing in this book. We firmly reject the Freudian readings. If anybody says id and super ego, I'm out. I think there's a much simpler explanation here, which is that he's interested in the same sort of things Oscar Wilde is interested in, the monster that lurks within each of us. And what happened, and of course, in both of these stories, in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and in Dorian Gray, both men think that they have found a loophole and that I can secretly indulge my dark side, but also maintain outward respectability. And then, well, we won't say the end here, but they find out that that there's a shelf life on that.
A very good way to set it up.
Do we want to start the first couple of chapters here and just talk about the way the story is set up?
Just a few pages here.
All right, well, let's go ahead and open up then. I better put my glasses back.
Oh, and this is a story with multiple narrators. I mean, one principal one, but the last couple chapters are going to be written from the point of view of other people. So it's a pretty easy story to follow along with, but the perspective of the voice does change once or twice.
Well, let's start off with the title. So we've said, he's not a typical Victorian writer. So he's calling it The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which would indicate to us something about what we're going to encounter here. This is not going to be David Copperfield, the story of the life of a person. This is going to be an oddity, something odd. Now, before we started the podcast, I was quibbling with Wikipedia because Wikipedia called this a Gothic novella. And of course, I got on my soapbox and said, this is not Gothic. Did we just use the word Gothic now to mean anything that's weird? And you were saying, apparently that is how we use it now, but it's not. It's not a Gothic novel.
I mean, often when we say Gothic, but what we're saying sort of loosely is anything scary or dark. But I mean, in the 19th century, a Gothic novel meant specifically something with set in old world Europe with theatrically ruined castles.
Very much so. The ruins of castle dungeons. And this is a very deliberately middle class setting.
Yeah, I mean, this is
lawyers and doctors, and we're in London.
If you were writing today, these characters would be living in an upper middle class neighborhood in the suburbs. And
I think that's so important to what he's doing here, and it's part of the reason why I'm taking issue with Gothic. So while your Netflix might say, this is a Gothic story, and by that they just mean it's creepy,
dark, there's some fog.
Exactly. But this was written in the 1800s, in the 1880s, when that word actually had a meaning. And so he's writing at the same time as, Frankenstein and Dracula, and those are Gothic novels. We're off in a weird castle somewhere in Europe, in this exotic location, and all these weird things are happening to us. And so I think it's important, and I'm just going to repeat myself here, but this is a deliberately middle class setting. And
So
we
it's
have,
actually anti-Gothic in a way because
yes, good point.
yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, I just saying that it's important that it's anti-Gothic because
Well, right.
it's set not in the strange and the weird. It's the weird and the strange are set in the ordinary, not the
Right. And since he's really trying to explore the evil that lurks within us and you know the monsters that are right here in respectable London, then yeah, I like what you're saying. It's the anti-Gothic novel. So instead of an exotic location, it's deliberately ordinary.
Oh, and amongst the other things, and Stevenson is, you know, it's a dream that inspires him to write this, but it was also, it seems, perhaps, you know, the result of some of his the reading he had been doing on his own, and supposedly he had been reading the Epistle to the Romans shortly before this book. With so specifically chapter 7. The passage
Paul
that,
says I am.
yeah, so
the things I do,
so yes, for we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. For that which I do, I allow not. For what I would, that I do not, but that I hate, that I do. If then I do that which I would not, I consent unto the law that is good. Now then, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me.
Oh,
so
wow.
Yeah. So yeah, kind of a scriptural bit that sets the stage there.
I'm trying to find, I can't find where I read this, but now that you say that, okay, something else that was going on in his life. So you can see how this makes total sense. Cindy and I like to vox our dreams to each other. And well, now we're getting some weird stuff in the story, but it's always interesting to see whatever we've been thinking about and reading about and talking about always sort of pops up in our dreams in some kind of way. But so a friend of his who was from Edinburgh or was living in Edinburgh, but was French. He got arrested for murdering his wife and ended up being convicted. And that actually really threw Stevenson for a loop. So
because this guy seemed kind of perfect.
That's right. He poisoned. And again, so this whole like, how could this guy who seems so respectable and good really be this monster? So he poisoned his wife. And then apparently in the investigation, they realized that back in France, he had probably killed a number of people too. It was probably basically a serial killer.
Oh, wow.
So you can see how that would also have come into play. So he's wrestling with, I was personally deceived by someone's public demeanor, and he seemed like such a great guy, and really he's a serial killer.
Oh man, I don't know if you watched that Ted Bundy thing on Netflix at one point, but I grew up in that era and I just thought, this guy, you just never in a million years would peg him if you met him somewhere as a serial killer.
Oh, the charming law student.
Yes.
Sort of look. Yeah.
Well, that's why he was so successful.
Yeah.
He was handsome and charming, and we're automatically disarmed by those people. Well, but actually that's very apropos to what we're talking about, right? We expect evil to look hideous.
Yeah. I mean, we really do. And
we're the naive ones.
Yeah.
We think evil's going to come up to us with a giant pentagram drawn on their face, but that is, evil is clothed as the angel of light, and that's how it deceives us.
Oh man, it's scary. It's scary when you think how easy it is to be deceived.
Well, yes, it really is. Okay, so we're starting off here with Mr. Utterson, the lawyer. And so we start off with this interesting little, I love actually the way he unfolds the story. I think it's very masterfully done.
Yeah.
So we don't even meet the principal players. We meet two minor characters who are talking about the weirdest thing happened.
Yeah. To our mutual friend.
Friend. And they, actually they don't realize it at first. The guy's just telling the story, and then, well, how many times has this happened in real life? You're telling a story and you think you're being totally anonymous and not gossiping. And the person you're talking to is like, I totally know who you're talking about.
Oh, I know this. Yeah.
Right. That very realistic setting here. And then they're both, and then they agree just to never talk about it again.
I love that too. I thought that's so Victorian. That's very Victorian, isn't it? This idea. Okay, sir, we'll never we agree to never bring this up again.
It is very Victorian. And so we have this, again, very ordinary opening. Two friends meet, they're chit-chatting, and we get a little mysterious hint here.
And on page 1, I mean, we have a description of the lawyer, Mr. Utterson, who really doesn't. I mean, he's a sympathetic character, but he doesn't come across as a remarkable man at all.
No, in fact, I've
Um,
read this so many times that I forgot about him. When I started
no,
reading, I was like, oh
I was like,
yeah,
oh
him.
yeah, him, yeah, the guy who tells most of the
But
story.
got a rugged countenance. I like that. He's not someone's going to be afraid of, weird
He is
shadows.
confrontational. I will say that for him, that he gets up in Jekyll's face and is like, we need to talk about Hyde.
Mhm.
So we have, okay, so what I noticed in this first chapter.
I love when he says that when he's saying that he's basically an unemotional character. He says he was backward in sentiment.
Yes.
That's kind of something almost Jane Austen-y in that line. He was a man backward in sentiment.
That's really good. So in this first chapter, I was really looking for foreshadowing and how Stevenson is setting up the story. And several things were very interesting to me. One, the descriptions of the man. Consistently, we are told he's not a man, he's a fiend, he's a juggernaut, he's all these other things. Especially the fiend, the monster. So a lot of language like that, which is setting us up.
Even he says when Hyde is confronted after trampling the little girl, he says, "I never saw."
You're jumping way ahead there.
Okay, well, I was going to say.
Well, go ahead.
Well, no, I mean he's literally compared to Satan. He says he pulled it off really like Satan.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I would say watch for the increasing satanic imagery around Hyde, because that is part of Stevenson's point here. So he introduces us to the idea that there is a strange connection between this monstrous man and our respectable friend, Dr. Hyde. Now, they don't tell us what that connection is in the first chapter, but they do say this, which I thought was so well done, that he went into a door in a building, and it's described as the building is so packed together, it's hard to say where one ends and another begins. And then later we're going to find out that Dr. Jekyll's house is way on the other side, but those two doors are actually connected. So Hyde's door and his door are connected. So I love this line. It's hard to say where one ends and another begins. The two doors, of course, would be the two public faces, but maybe the reality is that they're more connected.
One of those details that doesn't seem that important, but is.
It really struck me as I was looking for it, just how much he's packing in here. And then is it the second chapter we find out about the weird will?
Yeah, we don't find out about that until later.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not the second chapter. So in the second chapter, okay, I have marked all these things. Hyde is a fiend. He says his imagination is enslaved. That is going to become significant later. He's a juggernaut. It's labyrinths in the city. He says he can't understand Jekyll's weird friendship, which he calls a strange preference or bondage. So this slave bondage thing comes, and there's that great line, if he be Mr. Hyde, I shall be Mr. Seek.
At least he didn't say you can run, but you can't hide.
Oh! Didn't touch. Then I like this too. When Utterson confronts Hyde, this is our first real encounter with Hyde. Everything else has been hearsay. Mr. Utterson stepped out and touched him on the shoulder as he passed. Mr. Hyde, I think. Mr. Hyde shrank back with a hissing intake of breath. I always notice when characters hiss, because that means we've got a serpent, we've got a dragon, we've got a satanic monster when they're hissing. So, I mean, I guess in a way there are sort of some Gothic elements in the way the monster is being described, but he's deliberately setting it under this ordinary thing. He snarls, so he's animal-like, which that you see that a lot in stories. The more you become evil, the more animal-like you become.
There's something kind of like, I mean, like you said, diabolical, almost something kind of monkeyish about him.
I think that he might have actually used that word.
He gets, that he's small. He's physically small.
So that was something that was so fascinating to me. Like his face was different, his size was different. He wasn't afraid of being seen, like people will recognize me as Dr. Jekyll. he didn't expect them to recognize.
Right.
him.
So he's got safety that no one's going to know. You see that in Dorian Gray too. And I think what you end up seeing here is this, and we are all susceptible to this idea, that the real danger in indulging in your, what should I say, your evil
Private
proclivities.
life. Yeah, right.
The real danger is that someone's going to find out,
Mm-hmm.
and my
Mhm.
reputation will be ruined.
Mm-hmm.
That, of course, we know that is not the real danger. The real
Mhm.
danger is that you're destroying your own soul, and both of those books really show that beautifully. But initially, we just think, well, if I could get away with it, I'd do it. And so, yeah, he's got the perfect disguise here with Hyde. Here's go
we
ahead.
should talk about. I mean, it's Dr. Jekyll, but he's not. It's not just that he's a doctor. He's also a
scientist.
Everyone's most respected
Mhm.
man in the community. I mean, he's it gives a list of his titles. So it's MD, DCL, LLD, and FRS.
Yes,
FRS.
tell me what that
So
means.
FRS is Fellow of the Royal Society, and that's an honor which is only conferred on like the leading lights in their profession. So that's like being almost like being given the Nobel Prize for medicine.
So
or
he's
something like
literally
that.
the
So-
last person you would suspect.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. And he's also like a community leader. You get the impression he does a lot of good works for the people around him, and evidently someone who's not just liked by everyone, but who's kind of a pillar of his community, as they would say. The sort of guy who the mayor gives the key of the city to.
Oh, all right, very good. I want to read this is just chapter 2. This first description we have of Mr. Hyde. Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. He gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. He had a displeasing smile. He had borne himself to the lawyer with a sort of murderous mixture of timidity and boldness. And then going down, Mr. Utterson says, there is something more. If I could find a name for it. God bless me. The man seems hardly human. Something troglodytic. And then the whole, or is it old Dr. Fell, which I had to look up, but I'm sure you already
Dr.
knew
Fell.
that's Tom Brown's verse. I do not like thee, Dr.
The
Fell.
reason why I cannot tell, but this I know and know full well. I do not like thee, Dr. Fell.
So he's saying, is there, okay, like I'm really put off by this guy. Actually, this is a really, really good touch, because I think we all do this too. He has this encounter. He's like, that guy just rubbed me the wrong way. And then he
Yes.
thinks to himself, is there really something wrong with him, or is it just me? And that I've just, for arbitrary reasons, have decided I don't like this person. It's so interesting to me how people keep trying to give Hyde the benefit of the doubt and say, well, maybe I'm just being weird here. But then he says this, if ever I read Satan's signature upon a face, it is on that.
Yeah.
Of Jekyll's new friend. So now he's being deliberately connected to Satan, and again after the
All
attack.
these people, Utterson and Enfield and the others, they all know Jekyll, but they've never seen him in the presence of Mr. Hyde. They don't know exactly what the connection is, but they're going to start to suspect that
That's right.
maybe
Utterson
this
is the
guy's
only
got
one.
some sort of leverage on
Right.
Jekyll.
So
and
at
is
this
extorting money.
point in the
Yeah.
story, Utterson is the only one that knows there's a connection. And he knows it from
Mhm.
this weird will where Dr. Jekyll has willed all his money to Hyde, either in his death or his disappearance,
Yeah.
which Utterson thinks he has to be being blackmailed by this guy. This is the only way that this makes sense. I like this too. Again, this is all chapter 2. He's describing the houses now. I think this is very apropos. Around the corner from the by street, there was a square of ancient, handsome houses, now for the most part decayed from their high estate. So we've got, the buildings are decaying. And in
Mhm.
this type of story, that's always an allegorical reflection of the state of the people.
What's the post or Roderick Usher? Fall of the
Oh,
House
Fall
of
of the
Usher.
House of
that would
Usher.
be
Yep.
kind of the-
Same thing.
Yeah.
Yep. In fact, I was thinking exactly of
it's
that.
worth mentioning that Stevenson adored Poe.
I wonder.
And
Okay.
actually a lot of the darker Stevenson stories, like the Body Snatcher and some of those are very much of a kind of Poe atmosphere.
I
about them.
wondered, because I was definitely feeling some Poe vibes here. Because Poe is, we're actually going to do an Edgar Allan Poe story for our Halloween episode, so I'll save my comments about Poe. But Poe is also deeply allegorical in what he's trying to do. So these houses that he's looking at that were once ancient and handsome and now decayed, Utterson says the house is now plunged in darkness.
Mhm.
So we've got all of that. Then again, this is all chapter 2. We say that we find out there are 2 different doors. One is the door to Dr. Jekyll's house. The back door is to the laboratory. And I thought, okay, so we literally have a divided house. It's 2 houses in one house. And the servants are saying, we never see Hyde and Jekyll together. We only see Hyde in the laboratory. We only see Jekyll in the front of the house. So we've got it, we've got it well bumped up. Okay, so I'm looking at the time. I'm thinking we should stop here.
Oh, I think that's a good place. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
So we know there's some kind of odd connection between these 2 guys, and we're going to see what happens. Okay, so we will finish this up next time, and then we're going to take a short 2-week break as we prepare for our fall season. But I'll go ahead and tell you, we're going to be doing Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. We're going to start that in October. And we'll break about halfway through there and do a Halloween episode on Edgar Allan Poe. So I will be getting that schedule out to you soon. It'll be on our website, literary.life. It'll be in our Facebook group. And also, if you sign up for our newsletter at houseofhumaneletters.com on Fridays, Atlee sends out everything that's going on, including podcast schedules for the Well-Read Poem and for the Literary Life podcast, links, narration pages, all kinds of goodies. So you'll want to get on that to know what's going on there. All right, so stick around at the end of this podcast. As always, Mr. Banks reads us a story, and today's poem, not a story, he reads us a poem, and you've got a Robert Louis Stevenson ode to Stevenson poem today, right?
I do. Yeah. It's actually just called RLS by A.E. Housman.
So we'll be finishing off with that. So
Aw.
thank you so much to our Patreon. This is a member-supported only podcast. We don't accept ads. So thank you so much to those who continue to support us. And you can find out about that at patreon.com/literary-life. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram. You can find our commonplace quotes and the show notes at literary.life. You can even find out about our Literary Life commonplace books on our website there. You can find Mr. Banks and I at houseofhumaneletters.com, and you can find Cindy at morningtimeformoms.com and at her new podcast, The New Mason Jar. Mr. Banks also has a spinoff podcast of The Well-Read Poem. I, however, have my hands full with just one podcast. So we will see you all next week. Thank you for rating, reviewing, and subscribing, and for listening and for being a part of our community. And until next time, keep crafting your literary life, because stories will save the world.
RLS by A.E. Housman. Home is the sailor, home from the sea. Her far-born canvas furled, the ship pours shining on the quay, the plunder of the world. Home is the hunter from the hill. Fast in the boundless snare, all flesh lies taken at his will, and every fowl of air. 'Tis evening on the moorland free, the starlit wave is still. Home is the sailor from the sea, the hunter from the hill.